24 years old. So over a fourth of them were Gen Z. So before I said Gen Z, 6 to 24 years of age, we only talk to 18 to 24-year-olds for this. We're going to be doing a next step where we start talking to students, people 11 to 17 over the next couple of months and getting their perspective as well. So this is like older Gen Z. So we have Gen Z, we have older adults. We wanted to get information on both so we could kind of compare the different perspectives. Like, is Gen Z saying the same thing older generations, or are they saying something different? We also did a survey of adults in the Crossroads community. We had 385 adults complete the survey, and a third of them were Gen Z, and 2/3 were older age groups. And again, we wanted that comparison, which Gen Z saying versus what other age groups are saying. So think of these surveys. The first survey of people across the country is intended to help us figure out how do we reach them. Those are people who don't go to Crossroads, to help us with that perspective. And then those at Crossroads is how do we keep them engaged? How do we serve who we already have well? But then how do we reach other people outside? And we also did interviews with 19 of the Crossroads attendees. We did those after the survey, just to get some more rich information on their experience. I'm gonna skip this one. So our first key learning is don't change the recipe, but work on a couple of the side dishes. This was the language of somebody that I did an interview with. They're the one that used that language of don't change the recipe. So for Gen Z, who is here at Crossroads, they're satisfied with our in-person weekend services and most of our activities that we have for them. So I'll show you the data behind this. So we asked them, how satisfied are you with the following at Crossroads? And orange is Gen Z, blue is 25+-year-olds, 3 is quite satisfied, 4 is very satisfied. First thing I want you to notice is that orange, Gen Z, is more satisfied with all of these things than people who are over the age of 25. So the more satisfied, and when it comes to they're most satisfied with their overall experience, the music and worship, the opportunities to get involved and have impact, the weekend messages, and support for their spiritual growth. And all of those things are like components of the weekend service. A lot of them show up in that space. So they're very satisfied with the weekend service. When we ask them if they prefer in-person versus online versus a mixture of both, 73% said the in-person experience was what they wanted. When we asked them if they prefer that it happen on a different day or a different time, 88% said we want it on Sunday. Like, we're happy with what it is, don't change it. There were 7% that were like, let's bring back Saturday evening services. And then 4% that were like, can you bring back, like, add more times on Sundays? But in general, they wanted us to keep doing what we're doing. This graph is also looking at satisfaction of different activities that we do. The size of the bubble is how many people participated in the activity. How high it is on the scale is how satisfied they were. So again, a 3 is quite satisfied, a 4 is very satisfied. Orange is Gen Z, and you can see that Gen Z was quite to very satisfied with almost all of our activities that we do. And they're most satisfied with our go trips, with worship at the Cove, with camps, regular volunteering, and reach out activities is what they're most satisfied with. But we do have some other opportunities, and we'll get into those in a little bit. But in general, Gen Z who is here is satisfied with our weekend services. They're satisfied with the vast majority of our activities. Next key learning is that Gen Z's greatest pain and desire is for genuine connection. So we asked Gen Z across the country, what 3 words would you use to describe your life right now? Open-ended, they could put anything in there. The number one thing that came up most often was that they were sad, lonely, or depressed. So that's our number one pain, top most frequent pain for Gen Z. Next would be stressful, chaotic, or hectic. And then the next one would be boring or stagnant, which you could also look at it as a lack of excitement, purpose, or adventure in their life. When you look at Gen Z who is here at Crossroads, it looks a little bit different. They're not struggling not as many of them are struggling with sadness and depression. They are dealing with stress. They have very busy and full lives. So if you're thinking about like activities and how you're engaging them, they have a lot of competing priorities, the ones who are here already. Change or transition, a lot of them are going through changes, growth, spaces of their life during phases of growth. So maybe some growing pains that they're going through. But the pains are definitely a little bit different. The top pain is this loneliness and depression for people that we're trying to reach. But if you think about loneliness and depression, it's a lack of connection, like it's the isolation. So we also asked them about their satisfaction with different aspects of life. And you can see orange is Gen Z, blue is 25+-year-olds. Gen Z is less satisfied with all of these different areas of life than 25 and up. And there was also another survey that was done like nationally that after I did this, and they found the same thing. Like it was a Carrie Moss podcast. And so I was like, oh, they're seeing the same thing. It's less satisfaction across life areas. When we asked them what would they want the more support with, they said finances, mental health, and relationships, whether that be with family or friends. And you'll see like job and education, they were less satisfied with, but that's not what they wanted help with. They wanted help with finances, mental health, and relationships. When we asked them about their support system, only 1 in 3 said that they had 3 or more people outside of their family they can call on for help. 1 in 3 had friends who they share their deepest thoughts and feelings with. So 2/3 of them don't have a very strong support system. So when we started talking to Gen Z who are here at Crossroads, and we asked them about their what is your most frustrating experience, has been your most frustrating experience with Crossroads? Open-ended. The most common response was difficulty finding community or genuine friendships. Overwhelmingly most common response. And then second was that the teaching was not deep or biblical enough. I guess I skipped over this. For Gen Z who is here at Crossroads, 91% grew up Christian. And the majority of them identify as followers and producers. So we're talking like almost 80% would identify as already actively following Jesus. So that's, I think, why that one rises to the top. That's who we're attracting. We're attracting people who have a Christian background. Now this down here, the orange and the blue mean something different. In this slide, the orange is seeker or receiver, the blue is follower or producer. And if you look right here, you see that 1 in 4 Gen Z who are seekers and receivers have friends who they talk to regularly about their faith. And only 1 in 4 have somebody to go to for spiritual guidance. So 3/4 of them don't have anybody to talk to about their faith. And they're here, they're coming to Crossroads. We also asked them, what do you want most from your Crossroads experience? And what has been the greatest benefit of attending Crossroads for you? Both of these were open-ended, could put anything in there. And we had the same top 5 in this order responses to both of those questions. So what they want the most is community, connection, friendship. It's their greatest pain. It's the hardest thing for them to get, most difficult thing, but it's what they want that most, is friendship. And then second, they want to grow spiritually. So they want to get connected. And for the people who do, the greatest benefit of coming here is that sense of community and fellowship and connection that they get from it. And second, is spiritual growth. They also want to learn more about God and Jesus. They also want opportunities to volunteer and impact the community. They also want good worship music as well, but definite standout top number 1 is community, connection, and friendship. When we ask them, select the top 3 that are most important to you. I'll talk about the orange later, but if you look at green is having a spiritual guide or mentor to build into my faith. And red is small groups where I can connect more deeply with others. These are things that Gen Z would like, because they want mentors. And they want small groups for connecting. And you'll see like small groups or classes where I can learn more from God is also on here, but they didn't want that as much as they wanted ones where they could just connect and spend time with others. When we look at what have they been, look at different activities, we see that they're least satisfied with guides and with groups. When we ask them why, for guides, they talked about the process. The process felt disorganized to them. They talked about people lacking follow through. They talked about it not feeling very impactful because they weren't getting a genuine connection. They weren't developing a genuine connection with their person. For groups, when asked why, they talked about not connecting well with the group members being in different stages of life than them. For some people, it talked about the virtual format making it difficult to connect. Other people talked about groups being intimidating to start with. And you'll see that journey groups, the size of the bubble is pretty big. So a lot of them were engaging in it and they said, yeah, I'll give this a try. But it was one of our lower satisfaction activities. I will point out is that we're still like above a 2 here. So like the vast majority of people are still satisfied with the experience. It would just be our greatest opportunities. So we're not doing terrible. They're just our greatest opportunities to connect with them. And also like, this is what they're saying they want most. They want mentors, guides most, and then groups most. When it comes to satisfaction, here you can see that our greatest opportunities are around their least satisfaction with their ability to connect with people in their age and stage of life, and they're least satisfied with their sense of community at Crossroads. So those are the greatest opportunities here. And so one thing that definitely like showed up as I was looking through the data and having conversation is that stage of life really matters in this age group. And so I had people who were in college or just out of high school and they just started working instead of going to college. And they were talking about how different of a phase of life they felt like they were in than people who were already in their career or in grad school or a little bit further on or getting married, having kids. They felt like they were in a different space of life and that they would have difficulty connecting with people who were further along. Same kind of thing, conversation I would have with people who were in grad school or they just started their career and they're like, well, they're in college, like still in college. That's a very different phase of life right now. I'm just like feeling like they wouldn't be able to connect with them as well because they were in a different phase. And then you have people who are further along in their career and they're more established and more settled, and that felt like a different phase of life. Then I talked to other people who were single, and they talked about how they were in small groups with people who are married, with or without kids, and how they felt like they were in a very different space of life. And they would say things like, I can't imagine myself becoming best friends with this person because the way that they spend their life is very different than the way that I spend my time. So even though we can have conversations and we can connect in the moment, I don't see this being a long-term kind of connection. And the same was true for like married people with or without kids, as they talk about, well, I want to be connecting with other people who are married because I'm just trying to figure this thing out, figure out how to have a healthy marriage. And I want to be in community with other people who are trying to figure that out too, so we can learn from each other. Or if they have kids, like I want to be around other parents so I can, because they're going through a similar experience to me. And then there's this difference between seekers and receivers and follower and producers. And they didn't use that language. But people who were newer to the church that I talked to, they would talk about how like, I'm new around here, I'm just starting to get to know Jesus, like just starting to understand this stuff. And I'm nervous to join a group that's already established with people who are already further along in their faith. Because they're just further along and they're asking different questions and they know so much already and you all know each other already, and it just feels intimidating to me. And then you have the followers and producers who have been following Jesus for a while, and they're like, I want to be around people where we can go deeper, we can like dig in on different books of the Bible and Bible studies and stuff like that, because I want to go deeper, and I'm like, I don't want these seeker-oriented messages as much. I want something, a place where I can connect with people who are digging in deeper in my faith. So stage of life was talked about a ton and how that. So there was a lot in this section to unpack. So kind of a summary is Gen Z's greatest pain is loneliness and depression. They want community more than anything else, but many don't have it. And they want mentors and groups, but our current offerings aren't working as well as they would like. So when we're thinking about the side dishes, a couple of side dishes to work on is groups and young adults and guides. So focusing on the stage of life for young adults and for groups, potentially creating separate offerings for those in college or those new people. They talked about making our offerings more like apparent and more active across sites. So some people talked about how it was difficult they didn't know what groups were available. They didn't know how to find them, how to find the right group for them. So that process wasn't obvious. And other people talked about how, like at their site, they wish a young adults group was more thriving, or they had more offerings at their specific site. Like they knew Uptown had certain things, but they in Oakley, but they wish that their site had it as well. And then thinking about when people show up, like if all these people are joining journey groups, when they show up, how can we equip the leaders with strategies to help them connect when they're there? Like very intentionally, because it seems like it's more difficult for that like natural organic connection to happen. So how can we intentionally help people to connect? And then for guys, it's more about the process. How can we better equip the mentors, set higher expectations for engagement so that that genuine connection, like long-term connection actually happens. And then she talked about pairing them with somebody who's one step ahead in life. So here's an illustration of something else that I was noticing is like their goal, what they want most, like I said, is connection and spiritual growth. That's where we're trying to get them. We're trying to get them connected. We're trying to get them to grow spiritually. And they're on this tight wire. So the tight wire I kind of see is like the weekend service. It's our regular thing that keeps them moving along. It keeps them connected. It keeps them here. So they're moving along this. The lifeline is God. So if they fall off the weekend service, they stop coming, it's in God's hands how they're going to get there. And God can do that. But oftentimes they'll start with us, they'll come to a tentpole event, or they'll just come to a regular weekend service. And maybe they start attending for a little bit. Maybe they come to a camp because camps seem like something that is easier for them to engage in. So they come to a camp. Maybe they do some one-time volunteering or regular volunteering because more of them were participating in those activities. But then they get to this point where there seems to be a gap when it comes to getting them into a group. It seems like this seems to be a more difficult step for them to make it across. It's either difficult for them or scary, or like there's some kind of gap that's here for them. And so if you can imagine being this person on here, looking at that rope out there, being like, how do I get from here to that rope right there? That looks really far away. I don't know, like, what if they're struggling with depression? Like a lot of them are. And so they're questioning their self-worth, their abilities, their confidence, stuff like that. What if they're struggling with anxiety, like a lot of them are, they have more fears, more stuff they're dealing with. How are they going to get to that other rope? So what can we do to help them? So we can do a couple of different things. One thing is if you put another rope in there in between those ropes. So think about another offering that is less intimidating than a group, but is still a way that they could connect with other people, get to know them, and have some of those deeper conversations. So that's one way. Another way is how could you bring that rope down there closer to them so they don't have to come so far on their own. And so what that could look like is personal invite. So if somebody's leading a group or in a group, then being like, hey, I'm part of this group, you should come to this group. I would love to have you there. Like, I would love for you to connect. This is when we meet, you should come.
personal invite seems to matter quite a bit for this age group. And they might be more compelled to join a group if they already know somebody who's in it, they already, like, they feel encouraged, that person wants them there, to get a sense that they're already being welcomed. Another way to bring the group closer could be having, like I said, like we talked about, like a mentor or guide or somebody in their life to help them figure out how to find the right group for them. So how to navigate our processes and our systems, to figure out like where's their fit? How do they fit into Crossroads? How do they fit into this community? And then another option could be like website personalization, where like if we know so many things about them, then we can already go through our system and kind of figure out what a few good group options could be for them. And we could help them potentially put those in front of them and be like, here are 3 groups that we think could be great for you, if we already know that they're not in a group, and we could put this in front of them. So just different ways that we can bring that group closer to them. And so when I was talking to somebody in an interview, the way they phrase it is coming over halfway to reach them. So instead of expecting them to cross this whole gap on their own, how can we come closer to them and meet them over halfway? Another gap that I noticed is this gap over here. Before that like tentpole event or first weekend, we have tons of Gen Z out there. But we're not reaching all of them. We're primarily reaching church ones that already kind of get what church is like. So how can we reach them? How can we come over halfway for them? And a lot of people that I talked to have talked about going to where they are, letting them know about us, Crossroads, that we exist, and then making a personal connection with them. So some people talked about like us coming to college campuses, not just UC, but like across our region, going to different campuses, hosting some kind of event, or just showing up at their little like fairs and stuff like that. Maybe hosting a worship event, and then letting them know that we're Crossroads, what we're like who we are, without necessarily preaching or teaching to them. And then making a personal connection, so once they come here, they know somebody. So some other ideas, so like I said, events at regional college campuses, people talk about that a lot, so going across the area. People talked a lot about wanting regular worship nights at all sites, or at the college campuses, or at the Cove, or at like non-Crossroads locations. So that was brought up a ton. People, they like the worship nights. And then they also made a bunch of suggestions about like events that can help them to connect with each other. So they talked about college nights, they suggested block parties, formal hangouts after service where they can talk about what was talked about in the service and meet other people, get to know people. Talked about beer tastings, sports watch parties, sports outings, speed dating for friends, opportunities to meet people with similar interests or careers, so like interest groups, all sorts of different ways that they wanted to interact with people. And some of these I know, like we're doing a ton of this at Uptown. I don't know what that necessarily looks like across all of our other sites. So to take us back to our mission, if we look at our mission statement, the first verb or action in our statement is to connect. So that really gets to the heart, like how do we get really good at connecting people as core to our mission? So the next key learning is that Gen Z most values the triple A's: acceptance, adventure, and authenticity. So we asked Gen Z across the country, we gave them 15 different values, and we asked them to pick their top 3 that they valued most. And for Gen Z across this country, number 1 was acceptance. Number 2 was adventure. Number 3 was family, but if you can look at the older age group, like that dropped a lot for Gen Z across the country. And so next is authenticity. And you can see that those values show up in the other age groups. So Gen Z at Crossroads also values authenticity a lot and adventure a lot. they definitely ranked acceptance higher than any other group. Coming in first. I was encouraged to see adventure as number 2 because we just did our whole rebranding around adventure. That, woo, good, they value adventure. That's reassuring. So when it comes to acceptance, when we ask them to select the top 3 that are most important to you, number 1 by far for Gen Z was my church being welcoming and accepting. Now, what does that mean? It was phrased just like that, so it's kind of subjective. They just had to interpret that in whatever way they were going to interpret that. But over half of them said that was number 1, is that their church being welcoming and accepting. When we asked them, what 3 words would you use to describe Crossroads? Open-ended, they could put any words in there that what they wanted. You see, for Gen Z who's here, and for not Gen Z, the top ones, welcoming and fun, big. But you would also see for Gen Z here, they do use words like inviting, open, and accepting. So it does seem like we're doing pretty good in terms of being a welcoming church. Now, just note, the surveys all went out before the David Mahan talk and conversation, like within like a couple weeks before that. The interviews that I did were all in a couple weeks after that. So we don't know for sure if they would use those same words now, but in general, before that, like welcoming, we were winning there. We were doing really well at being welcoming. Now I have had people ask, like, is welcoming the same as accepting? Does acceptance mean something different than being welcomed? So just sit in that one. Somebody also pointed out to me that words like loving and caring did not make either lists. Doesn't mean that they weren't like further down on the list, but they weren't in like the top 10 most common words. Another thing that I was thinking is, so in my conversations with people, it wasn't solely around whether they felt accepted. A lot of them talked about how they could bring people, and they were really, it was about their friends being accepted. And they loved Crossroads because they could bring their friends here and we would be welcoming and accepting to their friends. So I had a lot of people talk about that. When it comes to adventures, our top rated most satisfied activities were go trips and camps. So our adventures are winning. They were rated as most spiritually impactful and their favorite experiences, along with regular volunteering. So adventures are winning among all age groups, really. So great segue into authenticity, around how do we trust. But here are just some quotes from the conversations that I had and interviews that I had. I'll just read one of them. Brian Tome is by no means the most formal or well put together man around. And I think he owns that and he knows that. I'll see him on Instagram and he's out riding his motorcycle or he's hunting and fishing. And like, here's this bloody deer carcass. So it's not well put together and buttoned up, which I think is good because by no means is my life well put together and buttoned up. So I think that it's easier to connect in that way. And so there were other comments. This one's about Brian. Not being super churchy and preachy. That one's about Brian, about being about the truth, whether it offends somebody or not. And so they appreciate his authenticity. This one's about our articles, somebody finding those authentic. So there is some evidence that they're finding different aspects of what we're doing to be authentic. So what we say, remember values, AAA, acceptance, adventure, authenticity. We have things that we say related to each of these. So for acceptance, we say things like, this place was made for you. No matter what you believe, you are welcome here. The Leader Summit had books that you belong here. Those are all getting at acceptance. For adventure, our whole rebranding, Born for Adventure, getting at that one. For authenticity, I've heard it said like real place for real people. How could we lean into that one, maybe some more with language? What do we do? I think we're doing a pretty good job of being a welcoming environment. So keeping on leaning into that. Teaching even more about God's reckless love and grace. Because if you think about Jesus, like how did Jesus show acceptance and convey that? It was radical what he did and the kind of acceptance he offers us. So how do we lean into those conversations and elevate those even more? Adventure, we just talked about creating more day-to-day adventures and regional trips that make it a little bit more accessible. So we have started doing regional trips. For authenticity, they like that we're talking about tough topics, so to keep doing those. They talked about sharing more testimonies of young adults, because they like hearing vulnerable stories about how God is working in people's lives, particularly people that seem like them. And then doing more interview style messages, because they like that in the moment, people talking and having interaction, it feels more authentic to them. Bringing back the Spark series, because they really like hearing all the different perspectives and experiences that come through that. And then they talked about talking more about topics relevant to young adults, like finances, mental health, relationships, sex, love, self-worth, pride, fear, and navigating change were all topics that they wanted to talk more about.
And I love how you asked those questions before, like how do we define things like acceptance and authenticity? Because I think that's really important as we're coaching group leaders, and to see how do they embody things like acceptance, authenticity, and adventure. If that's the place that people want to connect, how can they have those experiences that they're looking for within the groups that they're in?
All right, next key learning is that music tops the charts for Gen Z entertainment. So when we talk to Gen Z across the country, we ask them about what kinds of media they get, or how much and how often they consume different types of media. And they consume music most often than video games. And if you look, the orange is much higher than 25+-year-olds for music and for video games. So they're consuming music and video games much more often than older generations. TV less, and movies about the same. But music is common. When we ask them what 3 favorite things do you like to do in your free time as an open-ended question, the top 3 for Gen Z across the country were play video games, watch TV or movies, and listen to or make music. So music is high on their list. If you look at Gen Z at Crossroads, music is really high on their list too, of what they like to spend their time doing.
I mean, with the more adventurous things, ironically on the bottom.
Yeah, Gen Z at Crossroads, our branding is around adventure. We're gonna probably attract more people that like outdoor adventures.
Right.
So we're bringing them in. When it comes to Gen Z who's here, we asked them about their interaction with different Crossroads content. And they interact with our social media the most, considerably more than 25 and up. Then the weekend message, then music, and then there's a big drop off when it comes to the rest of our content that we offer. But they're engaging more in our music than older generations. And when we ask them what they're most satisfied with, it's the music and the worship here. And if you take into account both participation and level of satisfaction, the #1 activity that we offered to them was worship at the Cove. That's what they were most engaged and satisfied with, if you take that all into consideration.
I think that's not just Gen Z.
Well, if you look at the blue dot, it's not just Gen Z. So let's turn up the music. How can we do that? Do something like worship at the Cove again. Maybe it's not at the Cove, maybe it's somewhere else around the city, but having worship at non-Crossroads location. Offering worship nights regularly across the sites again, like I bring it up again just because so many people said it. Referencing and incorporating music more in messages, music that they'll relate to. Gamifying some of our experiences because they like video games, board games, games of all sorts. And then maybe engaging in TikTok and YouTube as platforms more. So posting those short, funny, authentic, inspirational testimonies, some kind of combination of those different kinds of videos on there. Because that's where, like, people would say, that's where we are, we're on social media. So engaging them on those platforms. Next key learning is that Gen Z is passionate about social justice and impact. And so we asked, what 3 topics do you get the most passionate about? They put anything in there. And #1, #2 tied for Gen Z across the country was social justice and human rights and music. And then you see, if you look at Gen Z at Crossroads, those are both really high for them too. And if you look at 25+ year olds at Crossroads, they really care about social justice and human rights too. And that included things like racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, child welfare, and human or sex trafficking. I'm gonna skip that. When we think about social impact, and look at volunteering, our volunteering activities, the size of the bubble is biggest for our volunteering type activities, whether that's one time or regular. So they're most engaged in our volunteering stuff. And that's where they can have impact. And when we look at what is most important to them, number 2 is their opportunities to serve others and have an impact in the community. So what they recommended above anything else is that we do more local service projects throughout the year. So think go local, but more often. And there's this like curiosity I have around like, is it that they, when we say impact their community, by community, are they defining that as like the city, their city? Are they defining that as Crossroads? Like, do they see bigger value in impacting the external community? Do they see value in serving here and impacting Crossroads community? So this is just a recap. I know we're at time. And orange is the most frequent suggestions that came from Gen Z. So you can see what's high on their list. This is everything that I've said before, but it's all just like summarized on one slide. So all the suggestions I gave before. But when you're thinking about what you're doing and what you're already doing, just think about how are you doing in terms of helping people to make genuine connections? How are people facilitating those connections when people show up? How is personal invite incorporated into that? How are you doing with incorporating acceptance, adventure, authenticity, music, social justice, social, and like having an impact? How are you incorporating these ingredients into the things that you're doing and elevating them? And thinking about that as you move forward and start creating new things. All right, that's all I got for you guys.